Hey guys, this is Mikro here. I hope everyone had a nice weekend. I decided to spend the entire weekend writing a simulation for New World that basically created scenarios where damage was applied. This damage I used to address meta gear and kind of came to some interesting conclusions. And I have drawn some like plots on here where you can kind of see how damage scales depending on like what factors I'm going to look at. And I wanted to talk about that today. The main thing that kind of prompted this journey was me realizing that Detonate is not affected by the amount of resil an opponent has if it crits. Why that's important is Greatsword has an ability where if you go into Onslaught, your next attack is a guaranteed crit, and Detonate can crit off of that, and that crit is not affected by resil. So if your opponent has 5 resil, or if they have 0 resil, that crit to Detonate damage will do the same amount, which is really scary, honestly, because that means that that resil perk that everyone is talking about, how you have to have 5 resil to get into PvP, there is no exceptions to that. It's actually not very helpful in that like one particular case. So I went about that and I decided to look at resil and see how important that was, as well as other combinations of gear that seem like they could be meta and kind of see if those would be viable. Basically, from this analysis, what it turns out is each Brazil piece effectively mitigates about 1.5 to 2% damage overall. It's so even though it's mitigating 4.9% of crit damage based off of like meta gear that people are running, it is actually not doing that much mitigation. I've looked at this for Fire Staff, I've looked at it for Great Axe because those are the two most common things that have a decent opportunity to do damage when they're critting. Great Axe having a 40% crit damage modifier due to perks in its tree. Fire Staff having a way higher crit damage modifier, like I believe about a 1.65, maybe 1.63. It's like up in that area. Uh, because of like lots of passive bonuses that the Fire Staff has. Both of those weapons, when crits are happening, they due to the randomness of the crit, it tends to not be actually as effective as people think. I took into consideration with melee weapons that they could backstab, and if you backstab, it's a guaranteed crit. And then based off that other percentage of the time that you weren't having a guaranteed crit, you have your random chance to crit. Did some like kind of weird math on there that I can walk through in a different video, but I don't want to walk through and bore people with today. But basically, it turns out that resil is not actually as mandatory as I think as people thought. If you are running 5 resil, you are mitigating about like 1.8, 1.9% of damage that normally incomes, and that also kind of helps a little bit at the extremes too. But overall, it's just Brazil is not as effective as I think as advertised, and there are opportunities there to run other pieces. So if you're in a spot where you're considering running for Brazil, and then you have your mandatory PvP perks for your build under based on this analysis, I would say that's 100% worth it. Would I drop to 3? I would feel a little bit sketchy about dropping to 3, but I don't think it's a terrible idea. Like you're gonna be taking on average 3% more damage if you drop to 3 resil versus great axes versus fire staffs, but there's other builds like Warhammer or other classes like Warhammer that critting really does not change anything. Void Gauntlet, like critting does not really change anything. A lot of builds in the game, critting actually is not super scary. It's not beneficial to that weapon as a whole. But there's other weapons like Fire Staff, like Bow, Great Axe, that critting does give them a decent amount of advantage and allows them to hit some scary damage numbers. Like based off of the space damage, I set the space damage to what it is about in game, and a Fire Staff and a Great Axe, like with an auto attack, if given the right conditions, can hit very high numbers. This is for Fire Staff in this example, so Fire Staff can hit up to like 5,000 damage off an auto attack given the basically perfect conditions. But for the most part, it's not going to be hitting that hard. So that's based off of that analysis. The other thing I wanted to talk about too is like, so if you are in a spot where you're thinking, hey, maybe I want to drop actual resil here, like what am I thinking about going? It turns out there's like some illegal PvP gear that has no resil but has shirking for it and has LE aversion. I thought this was kind of interesting because that would actually work versus the detonates, but wouldn't work in general. And that gear turns out to be a little bit worse. So here I normalize everything based off the lowest value. So like the lowest value, like in terms of damage mitigation, which would be like 5 elemental, would be 5 the lowest, sorry, not lowest damage mitigation, the lowest damage that's being done. So elemental aversion turns out to be a little bit better than shirking fort if you assume that shirking fort has an uptime of around 50%, which I think is about accurate. And based off of that, we can kind of see where other pieces lie. If you have that like 5 elemental aversion and 1 shirking fort, you're gonna be taking about 1.01 percent more damage than just having 5 elemental aversion, 5 resil. But then you also have to take into account that in that case you're going to be a little bit more protected versus detonates, which you wouldn't be protected as against before. So maybe that balances out. I think the part that makes this interesting is those pieces are dropped in the wild. They're kind of free BIS, if you will. And based off of this analysis, I think those pieces are very viable, and you definitely could run them. I don't know if it's necessarily better in all situations, but there's an argument that it is beneficial due to the detonate damage not being mitigated by resil. So there's like a trade-off there, but basically those pieces are definitely viable from a PvP perspective, so I came up to the conclusion. Here you can kind of see some of those damage numbers and when they're really big and when they're really small in those kind of edge cases. So if someone has like a fire staff versus like a 5 resil target, which you see the amount of resil over here on this column, uh, that the crit damage modifier is still pretty high, just due to fire staffs inherently having vicious. They have a lot of like uh, crit damage boosting perks in their tree that they run, and based off of that, they will be doing a decent amount of damage. But if you are, say, weakened, the target has 15% damage absorbed versus you, which I think is a fairly common thing. And then this is run percentage, so if it's like a small number like this, that means that they're fortified. So if the target is fortified, then they'll not be taking as much damage, and that's where you get the smaller damage numbers because all these kind of aspects multiply versus each other. Versus if the target's like rended, you're empowered, you have the crit, you hit the crit, then it's just going to be hitting like a decent amount harder. So there's like kind of an interesting aspect there, but uh, overall, I would say that resil is still pretty important, but I wouldn't say 5 resil is as important as people would say it is. In terms of like looking at some other things I thought were interesting, I looked at something that a lot of melees may. I don't think a lot of melees follow this rule, so melees in general in this game, I think they are generally in tune, in at least in NA, with what is good on Great Axe, but I think melees are very, very bad in terms of like optimizing for Warhammer. And looking at that from an outside perspective, I took this like kind of statistical analysis, which I am using 100,000 like random scenarios with these conditions, which can kind of allow me to get a good estimate of like, is this perk better than this perk kind of thing by just changing that singular variable. Looking at that from a Warhammer perspective, one thing that Warhammer players do is they run attunement on their Warhammer almost all the time now as a damage increase, and I think attunement just in general makes sense for most weapons. It's just consistent flat damage. The thing with Great Axe is you tend to proc shirking if you run that like pretty consistently. So something I looked at was there is shirking with an elemental damage that some people run in other regions but don't necessarily run in NA. And I looked at the shirking aspect of, say you have that shirking proc 20% of the time. It turns out if you have shirking proc 20% of the time, you have a pretty significant damage increase. If I run this and show this output, you could actually see that shirking increase. So that you're going to be doing like on average a 200 more damage. But if you look at those max values, that's where it gets really, really interesting. So if you have shirking and you proc that with the right conditions, you could be hitting people for very, very hard with Warhammer attacks. This isn't like a perfect simulation by any means, but it gives you an idea in terms of scale of like how much better that shirking is compared to uh, what do you call it? Compared to attunement. And if I look at that in terms of like actual like normalizing it, that shirking is doing on average 7 point. Is that 7.8? Yeah, that's 7.8% more damage than attunement. And the reason why is that shirking is doing 40% extra base damage, that attunement is doing like 12% extra base damage. Turns out that 40% is very, very beneficial to other parts of your kit. So based off this analysis, I would say a lot of Warhammer players are actually running the wrong build for that for that Warhammer, and they should be running shirking over attunement, and they should be playing to proc that, land that heavy attack, get all those bonuses going, and then just go for the big dam. And that's something that I think a lot of people have messed up on. I can walk through this like kind of in a different video, but I just wanted to talk about the high level there where resil is really not as important as some people think it is. It's only somewhat effective, and shirking is fairly good in terms of Warhammer aspects. And if you run those illegal perk pieces that don't have a resil, or you're dropping like a resil for a thing that's important to your class, like for an IGVG, getting an extra refreshing maybe, getting like another weapon perk like a diminishing orb. I don't think that's a bad trade-off at all. Just know that you're on average going to be taking about 1.5% more damage because you went for that trade-off. If you think that trade-off is worth it, and you are going to be that 1.5% extra damage that you're taking is worth the missing a slot, then by all means go for it. If you don't think it's worth it, then I would consider just running that 5 resil, 5 elemental aversion, or 5 shrinking fort, and just not really thinking about stuff. And I guess the last thing I'm going to leave on is this obviously kind of comes back to the idea that has been the long debate amongst content creators, amongst players like, is shirking fort better, is elemental aversion better? If you proc shirking fort 50% of the time, elemental aversion is better. And I think that's pretty accurate. If it's a higher amount than that, like 75%, then I still think elemental aversion turns out to be a bit statistically better. So I would tend to say elemental aversion is better, but the other aspect that this does not take into account is that coverage basis, where if you run elemental aversion, it's not obviously gonna not work versus melee players, so you're gonna miss out on any damage mitigation versus melees. So I'm pretty sure it just comes down to preference at the end of the day. If you run elemental aversion, you should run more physical gems, so you should have like 15% physical gems with 5% elemental versions, like what I would generally say. And if you're running that shirking fort, you generally need to be running more elemental gems in the current meta because fire staffs hit pretty hard and detonates hit pretty hard. And that those elemental gems and that elemental version will work versus detonate, versus resil will not. And with that, I'll leave you guys and enjoy the rest of your weekend, or enjoy your week if you are seeing this video a bit later. All right, peace.